Welcome to the Emerging Civil War Podcast. I'm Chris Mikowski, and joining me today is my great ECW colleague, Dave Powell. Dave, how are you today?
I'm excellent, sir. How are you?
Awesome. I'm doing well. I suppose you're especially excellent because you have a new book out, which is always a reason to feel good.
Yes. I'm I'm expecting somewhere on the order of about 150 copies to show up in my driveway in about any day now. I mean, it
Uh,
could be tomorrow, it could be Friday. So,
and then and then comes the writer's cramp and the shipping them off to all the
yep.
folks who pre-ordered, huh?
Yeah, I walk in with a stack of heavy envelopes and my post office people shudder.
I've gotten to the point where I actually take donuts down to them at Christmas time and stuff like that. Just try to stay on their good side since they do a
Yeah,
lot of
they're
heavy lifting.
they're actually fairly interested to know that I'm an author and these are books and they kind of get a kick out of that. So
Yeah. So this is the latest in your ongoing study of the Atlanta campaign. So give us the quick overview of what this book covers, and then we'll kind of get into some of the nitty gritty.
sure. So volume one covered essentially operations up through May 20th, 1864. And it opened with a great deal of maneuver. Sherman outflanked the Confederate Army of Tennessee a couple of different times. So volume two opens really with the last week in May and covers all the way to June 27th, 1864. So virtually all of the month of June. And it opens with a big sweeping flank movement. Sherman once again doesn't want to fight the Confederates, Joseph Johnston, head on. So he looks to outflank him, get through Paulding County, Georgia, to a place called Dallas, and then on to Marietta, cut in behind Johnston. But it doesn't go that way. And so the combat and the fighting that I describe in June ends up being much different than the military action, the operations of the first part of Volume One.
So now you just said it basically covers the fighting in June. Now you're not intentionally setting this up. So this is like May, volume one, June, volume two, July, volume three. It's not intentionally falling out that way, correct?
No. Um, for one thing, once our good friend John Bell Hood takes over, there's a lot to write about.
Yeah.
It's basically designed so that I hang one big battle in each book.
Okay.
Volume one covered Resaca, which was a 2 day engagement. Overall, about 140,000 troops involved. Volume two covers uh, Kennesaw Mountain, and though it's a much smaller, much more focused affair, only about 15 or 18,000 Federals and just those Confederate defenders at Resaca, or who were attacked at Resaca, just a couple of divisions. Uh, it's a very detailed battle narrative, and then so volume three will center on Peachtree Creek.
Okay.
Uh, volume four will be the exception. It will cover two battles. It will cover the big Battle of Atlanta, July 22nd, and also the Battle of Ezra Church, which is a somewhat smaller action, and it happens on July 28th.
Mhm.
So volume arguably volume one covers everything from January to May 20th, 1864. Volume two sort of telescopes down to 5 weeks. Volume three is even shorter, just about 4 weeks. Volume four is going to cover 10 days.
Yeah.
And then volume five will wrap it up with Jonesboro, and that will cover all of August and the cavalry raids. A lot of stuff going on in August, but Jonesboro is the big battle there. So
Right.
it's all tailored to make sure, as our publisher Ted Savis, keeps groaning every time I announce a page count. Uh, it's to make sure that we publish it in digestible bites and
Right.
readable bites.
Right. Because, the Atlanta campaign, of course, is sprawling, months long, but still, I think, relatively understudied for the scope of the action and the import that it has, toward the conclusion of the war. Why do you think it has not gotten quite the attention that, like, a Gettysburg or something like that has had?
Well, uh, as I think pretty much everyone knows in Civil War scholarship, for many many years there was a an imbalance between Eastern actions and Western actions.
Right.
Um, a lot of that was driven by the sort of mythos and success of the Army of Northern Virginia and Robert E. Lee. The Army of Tennessee is not that kind of army,
Right.
and so and then also it's a big campaign, and there's a great deal to write about, and I think that's also somewhat intimidating.
Mhm.
We have uh, really a campaign history written in the 1880s by participant Jacob Cox, which is still a nice overview, but it omits so many things because
Right.
Cox only had like 200 pages, and it's mostly focuses on what his personal frame of reference was. Uh, and Albert Castell in 1992 publishes Decision in the West, which is a single volume overall campaign history.
I literally had that book in my hand coincidentally this morning. Nothing to do with this interview, but interesting you bring it up.
Which again is it's a good book. It's still very readable. I don't, I don't disagree with most of his conclusions. Uh, he might he might beat Sherman up a little too much, maybe. Uh, and
Well,
then
someone had to because Joe Johnson and John Bell Hood weren't. But boom. No, sorry.
a good point. And in the past, I don't know, 25 years, certainly, we've started to see a number of battle books. The Battle of Peachtree Creek and the Battle of Atlanta. There's a couple books on each of those battles. There's been books on the Battle of Kennesaw Mountain, but they're very um, their focus is different, I guess, is the way to put it. I don't want to denigrate the battle books. They focus on their activity and what's going on, but they don't provide you an overall frame of reference. Um, you don't necessarily know, for instance, how much the command status of the Army of Tennessee has changed between May and July 20 when the Battle of Peachtree Creek is fought. Uh, you know, if you've followed that campaign, then you know that Hood is fighting with two brand new corps commanders, and four of his 10 divisional commanders are new, either newly promoted or just inherited the division because the divisional commander got sick. It's things like that you don't necessarily notice in a battle book, or a battle book doesn't bring out uh, as much as a campaign narrative might.
Yeah. I actually had that experience just recently. I was doing some tours for the American Battlefield Trust for the Overland campaign, and I actually got to go from North Anna to Totopotomy Creek to Cold Harbor, which is a part of the campaign I don't normally get to do because I'm up here in the wilderness in
Right.
Spotsylvania, right? And the armies, as they leave North Anna, are so different than when they start the wilderness. And you don't necessarily see that in a battle book. You kind of have to watch the evolution of the army over distance and time. So I kind of want to start there with you as far as, when you get into volume two, how are these armies different than the armies you got to work with and research in your first volume?
Well, command turnover is a part of it. The numbers equation changes pretty drastically. And I don't think people appreciate that as much either. At the beginning of the campaign, Joe Johnson says he's outnumbered, 50,000 Confederates to 100,000 Yankees. And he's not wrong. Uh, but by the time, by May 28th, for instance, when after they fought the actions at New Hope Church on the 25th, Pickett's Mill, um, the balance of forces is probably as even as it's going to be in this campaign. Sherman says he crosses the Etowah River on May 23rd with about 85,000 men, uh, after deducting casualties and people he's had to leave behind a garrison. So he's got about 85,000 troops. And Johnson's peak numbers are probably, it's hard to tell because Confederate reports aren't as good as Union reports,
Right.
but uh, he has probably about 75,000 troops. So the ratio is much different.
Yeah.
Uh, it's no longer 2-to-1 odds. The armies are almost even. Now that's going to change again because June is not only a difficult terrain that they're campaigning in and constant fighting for almost 5 weeks, but also the weather turns horrible. 19 days of rain, everything's flooded. The soldiers are cold and wet. I know cold in Georgia in June doesn't seem appropriate, but they have some cold days and they're wet all the time. Sickness takes a great toll on both armies. And so, uh, as the campaign ends, the Sherman's advantage in numbers, I guess, the relative ratio is going to increase in Sherman's favor again. Not as dramatic as it was at the beginning of the campaign, um, but numbers are a whole other story in this campaign because John Pell Hood has a vested interest in showing that Johnson lost far more men than Johnson claimed. Johnson has a vested interest in suppressing his losses, uh, and Sherman's numbers are. Sherman's using a couple of different tabulations that we don't normally think of in terms of combat effectiveness. Uh, he wants his soldiers, his corps and divisional commanders to report something called effectives. And that means not only the men present for duty, but also short-term sick. He's really interested in reporting the number of people he has to feed.
Mm.
And that's important because to Sherman, this entire campaign is about logistics. And June is a tough month for him, in logistically speaking.
As he has to stretch down from Tennessee into Georgia, his problems compound as he goes in a bunch of different ways. You know, like how he's got to feed him, how he's got to protect, how he's got to communicate. Walk me through some of those challenges that I think get exponentially harder for him the further into Georgia he gets.
Yeah, it's inevitably you have to leave men behind. You have to create garrisons. Otherwise, Confederate partisans and cavalry will just come in behind you and tear up all the railroad tracks and burn your depots. Uh, he's establishing, he's following a pattern that really the Union armies under Buell and Rosecrans began all the way back in 1862. Um, they establish a big supply depot. In Buell's case, it was Louisville. In Rosecrans' case, it was Nashville. And then they start advancing those supply depots. So Sherman is primarily operating out of a chain of depots, Louisville, Nashville, Chattanooga. In each case, he wants to stockpile a lot of supply so that if the Confederate cavalry come in behind him and cut his lines, he's not immediately in a crisis situation. Um, uh, it's so that's a major concern, but that also requires a lot of troops. Uh, 5,000 men here, 5,000 men there. Pretty soon you're talking about a large army behind you. Uh, and just to give you some perspective, when Sherman opens the campaign, he expects to have to feed 100,000 men and 30,000 animals, horses and mules, uh, going forward. That's south of the Tennessee River. Uh, Ultimately, at the end of the campaign, when the quartermaster general turns in his reports and they do the final tabulations, they have basically fed 150,000 men and 60,000 animals for 5 months.
Wow.
Yes,
That's a lot of mouths.
it's an enormous logistical effort. It's frankly, it's the largest U.S. Army logistical effort up until World War II, almost. I mean, I omit World War I because in World War I we relied very heavily on the French and British for our arms and things like that.
Right.
But so yeah, it's stupendous effort. And that's what Sherman is uppermost. So that's why his numbers can be a little bit different than the way that Johnson and Hood are counting their numbers. Of course, um, uh, uh, the Confederates have a couple of competing different priorities. Johnson wants to maximize his success against Sherman and minimize his losses. Hood, conversely, wants to maximize Johnson's losses, saying that the army that was turned over to him was suffered a ton of casualties, a lot more casualties than Johnson will admit to, and thus he was materially weaker when he got the army. And so sorting through all that has been an interesting challenge, and I'm not done with it. I'm volume two will hit the bookshelves and hit the stores here very soon. But I'm 130,000 words into volume three already, so I live
So,
with it
so,
every day.
so we're not going to get it in volume two, this dispute between Hood and Johnson necessarily, but when Hood
Correct.
takes over here in volume three, that's when these guys are really kind of going to go at it in a battle between them that goes on until they're both
Well,
dead.
yeah. I mean, Hood dies in 1879. His memoirs published in 1880. His memoir is largely a response to Joe Johnson's 1874 writing and earlier. And Johnson will still be writing about Hood well after Hood's dead. I think Johnson dies in like 1896 or something. I forget his exact date. But yeah, uh, it's something that both men will carry to their graves.
Wow, that's a long time for Hood to get rent-free space in Johnson's head.
There are a lot of folks up there in Johnson's head.
Yeah. Oh
Davis.
yeah. Right. What about the quality of the men in Sherman's army group? Are we still talking like a good hardened bunch of guys who have been fighting through the war? Are we getting a lot of green recruits? Are there a lot of conscripts? What's the quality of these men?
Well, as you might expect with an army with three armies that size, um, you get a mix of people. Certainly, the core are still the veterans. The Army of the Cumberland, uh, in the regiments of the 3-year enlistments that run out starting in 1864, and they try and encourage the veteran volunteers to reenlist. Uh, Ultimately, I think something like 20,000 of the Army of the Cumberland men reenlist.
Hmm.
And so that provides a core of command competence because many of them are now proven field officers, colonels, and majors, and in some cases the brigadier generals. Um, and then you get troops that were raised in 1862 who are also veterans, but their 3-year enlistments haven't run out. And so they're another core component. You get a lot of troops, the Union 23rd Corps, for instance, have been in service for a couple of years, but haven't had a lot of combat experience. They're
Hmm.
from East Tennessee. They've chased rebels, and some of them have been involved in stand up battles, but by and large, they haven't fought in battles like Chickamauga and Perryville and Shiloh. And then one of the interesting stories that I found that's in volume one is that when those veteran volunteers went home to reenlist, well, they reenlisted, then they got to go home for a furlough. Well, they beat the drums hard, and they came back in many cases with lots and lots and lots of recruits.
Hmm.
And so, some of the Ohio regiments, for instance, that maybe had a corps of 150 or 200 veterans, had 500 or 600 men in their regiments.
Wow.
And of course, if you mix recruits with veterans, especially motivated volunteer veterans as opposed to draftees, it's the best way for the old soldiers to teach the new soldiers and to become combat effective. So I think the armies are highly competent. The Confederates, by and large, there's no need for veteran volunteers in the Confederate Army. Everybody's in the Army, and while some of them go through symbolic reenlistments, everyone also knows they're just symbolic. They're by act of Congress, they're retained.
Yeah.
and I think the Army of Tennessee is committed to the cause. They're going to fight hard, and they do fight hard. But Johnson and then later Hood will have just an ongoing problem that they can't solve, and that's there's a desertion problem in the Confederate Army. Um, and through most of this campaign, really through the spring and into the campaign, the Confederates lose about 1,000, 1,100 men a month to desertion. That's a
Wow, that's a
brigade a
lot of
month.
people. That's a
Yeah,
lot. Yeah, that's a
yeah.
lot of
Four
people.
months, you've just lost a division of infantry.
Mhm.
So um, it's a problem that's Confederacy wide, and these are the the late war or the later war draftees, the men whose homes are now well behind Union lines, Tennesseans, North Georgians, who are just tired of war, weren't really committed to the cause that much anyway, and don't see any point in sticking around to get shot.
Yeah.
So so while the core, 50 or 60,000 men that make up the Army of Tennessee are committed and will fight to the bitter end, some of these guys will be at Appomattox, or not Appomattox, but at
Bennett,
Bentonville and
Bennett Place.
yeah. Uh, so, but it's a problem that the Confederacy never fixes.
Mm. So in volume one, you talk about how Sherman's kind of got to get his army group organized and settled in and sort of get them road ready. Joe Johnson coming to command in the winter. He's got to get his army road ready. They have the chance to open that campaign at Rocky Face Ridge, Resaca. They really get the chance to really field test themselves in a pretty significant way. So, coming out of volume one into volume two, what lessons are these armies taking into volume two for you?
Well, it seems clear that for all of Johnson's discussion in his memoir and his articles discussing the campaign after the war, he doesn't know how to handle Sherman's outflanking moves.
Mm.
Um, he talks after the war a great deal about looking for opportunities to pitch into Sherman after he's been after his numbers have been attrited, after catch him crossing a river or something like that, catch him off balance. But the couple of efforts he makes are fairly half-hearted, and they don't really go anywhere. Um, I don't think he knows what to do. I don't think he has a strategy, and that's reflected in a lot in the Confederate Army. One of the things I try and do with all of this writing is get as many primary sources as I can. It's especially important for the Atlanta campaign because we don't have quite so many reports as, say, Gettysburg or Chickamauga, or it's just an ongoing campaign. Many officers are wounded or invalided out, never get a chance to write reports. Some of the people who sit down to write reports at the end of the campaign are captains or majors who had no clue, uh, and so they don't know what happened at Resaca or Kennesaw. Uh, as a result, um, those primary sources are ever more invaluable, but they also reflect, a lot of them reflect the idea that they're very frustrated with Sherman as well, at
Okay.
the individual level. The sergeants and the privates and the company grade officers are like, Sherman's going to go flanking again. They expect it, um,
Yeah.
and they're very frustrated. They're certain they can beat the Federal Army in a stand up open field battle
Okay.
if he'll just come fight us.
And these are the Confederate sergeants and privates who are frustrated.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Okay.
Not just the generals. Yeah. The rank and file.
So now I'm interested in what you said though. Like sure, like Johnson doesn't have a plan. He doesn't know how to handle this, and I think common perception is like, well, of course he's just going to retreat because that's what he did at the peninsula, right? And so it seems like it's just Johnson's planned default. But what I'm hearing from you is like he's kind of doing it because he doesn't know what else to do, as opposed to maybe having some intentionality about it.
Yeah, his first thought, because if Sherman divides his forces and send troops on a wide arc, there for most of these flanking moves, Sherman is operating in on a broad front. He's separated by as much as 25 or 30 miles, um, which can be a day or 2 days march in some of this terrain.
Right.
So he has to, if he's going to outflank the Confederates, especially in Volume 2, where the balance of forces is no longer 2-1. I can't confront Johnson with 50,000 while I send my other 50,000 around. Now Johnson has 75 and I have 85. And Sherman has a fairly good grasp of the numbers.
Yeah.
Perhaps not as precise as that, but he knows that his advantage is diminished. So if he detaches 20 or 30,000 men, if detaches the army of the Tennessee, McPherson's, army from troops from Mississippi for a deep flank march to Dallas, for instance, he knows that there's a potential that the Confederates could strike McPherson before he can bring up the rest of the army to help him. One of the things that I make a point I make in Volume 2, and I noticed as I was writing, when Grant moves into the wilderness, Robert E. Lee says we're going to fight him there. We're going to move in and fight him. Why? Because the wilderness terrain is going to negate some of his major advantages, artillery. He will have trouble moving his larger numbers against us. Well, Sherman is moving through the Alatoona mountain range, which is very rough country, not high, but very rugged, steep valleys, steep ravines, a number of creeks. And so he's going to find it difficult to move through the Alatoona range to Dallas. It's the same kind of terrain, but Johnson's reaction is not to turn and try and hit Sherman while he's in that rugged country, but rather to get out in front of him. And he does at New Hope Church in Dallas and Pickett's Mill. But was there an opportunity to maybe land a counterpunch the way Lee did in the wilderness? I suspect there was.
And is this Johnson worried about his reputation, or he just doesn't have the nerve, or just completely
I
discombobulated?
think he's the kind of general who sees disaster first.
Okay.
He's not to go back to Grant too much, but you remember Grant talking about his first experience of combat, so to speak, in Missouri.
Yeah.
I realized that I was thinking too much. I have to paraphrase. I don't remember the exact quote, but I was thinking too much about what the other guy could do to me and not what I could do to the other guy. And I think that's exactly Johnson's problem.
Yeah, and then
His
he says,
problem through the war.
yeah, and he says like Grant found out the other guy was just as afraid of him.
Yes,
He was the other
exactly.
guy. Yeah, so Johnson's not thinking that way. He's just thinking about being afraid.
Yeah,
Yeah,
his first thought is he'll cut my supply line. I can't. We'll have to retreat.
yeah, yeah. Along those lines, though, like as the campaign goes on, he wants to send Joe Wheeler to cut Sherman's supply line, which I guess sounds like it's very much in the way of kind of the way he's thinking about his own situation and what are his own vulnerabilities. And
Well,
so like, oh, let's go after Sherman's
he wants someone
Yeah.
to cut
Well, yeah.
Sherman's supply line, but he doesn't want Joe Wheeler to do it
Yeah.
because that would take
Uh,
troops away from him.
yeah.
He
Or for
wants
I think he says Forrest. I'm sorry. I
Yes, he
misspoke
wants
there. Yeah.
Forrest or even John Hunt Morgan, the Kentucky raider who's operating in sort of Southwest Virginia, East Tennessee with about 2,000 men.
Right.
Um, and then Johnson also sort of moves the goalposts a little. Initially, it's send him into Tennessee, cut the Nashville and Chattanooga line between those two cities. But after Johnson retreats, he instead wants Forrest to come to North Georgia,
Hmm.
um, uh, cut the Western Atlantic below Chattanooga. Um, during the June and July periods of 1864, Nathan Bedford Forrest, Bryce's Crossroads, the Battle of Tupelo, and so on and so forth, all in Mississippi. But Forrest himself wants to go to Middle Tennessee. He doesn't want to go to Georgia.
Right.
So there's but the real sort of bottom line of it is that Johnson wants somebody to cut those rail lines, but he doesn't want to give up any troops to do it.
Right, right. And you know, as you talked earlier about all the mouths that Sherman has to feed, I mean, that certainly seems like a really good idea then to affect Sherman's ability to feed those mouths.
Well, it's one of Sherman's greatest priorities is to maintain the rail line. So if that's what your enemy is most afraid of, it probably is a good idea to do
Yeah.
something along those lines.
Yeah.
And to be fair to Johnson, he does send small bands of partisans, um, small detachments of up to 500 cavalrymen, and they do interrupt Union rail traffic on the Nashville or on the Western Atlantic in a number of different places starting in June. Uh, there are there are numerous derailments and blockages. So I don't know, probably for 10 or 12 days in that 30-day period, the rail lines aren't running because of Confederate activity. But it's never large enough that the local garrisons can't deal with it. And of course, the other thing that the Union Army has done so superbly is create these rail repair units that just slide in. There's a break, 3 mile break in the line. We'll fix it in 10 hours. I mean, need a bridge across the Oostanula. Okay, we can do that in 3 days. The rail bridge across the Chattahoochee when they cross the Chattahoochee, 4 days. I mean, they're doing really incredible engineering stuff.
As I recall, like they spend some time measuring all the bridges and stuff and like creating inventory. So they're like, oh, if this bridge gets ruined, here's what we're going to need to fix it. And they kind of have an inventory that
Yeah,
they can just
they
snap
have
right into place.
they have pre-built trusses and uh, they're ready to go. It's a
Yeah.
really impressive effort.
Yeah. So, and again, the one reason I always like talking to you because you know I'm already walking away with all these things to be thinking about. So, missed opportunity at Alatoona Pass, which I've really never heard anybody talk about in that context before. So now I got to think about that for a little bit. But Sherman gets his way through the pass, and eventually he's going to find himself in combat with Johnson at Dallas, New Hope Church, Pickett Mill. Kind of, how does that encounter or that series of encounters end up panning out? How does that happen?
Um, the other thing that I kind of take away from, especially in Volume Two, is Sherman's rising frustration with the campaign.
Hmm.
We don't necessarily think that. Why would Sherman be frustrated? I mean, he's pushing Johnston back, uh, uh, but as I indicated at the beginning, the campaign changes in June. Things go much slower. They're much more difficult. Instead of, in Volume One, basically, Sherman covered half the distance to Atlanta in 2 weeks, 50 miles.
Hmm.
Um, well, that's not going to happen here. He's going to go. I think by June 27th, uh, his rail depot is at Big Shanty, and he's only picked up about 20 miles. So he's very frustrated, and a lot of frustration comes pouring out to Grant and to Halleck back in Washington during this time, where he can't get anybody to move. And so uh, New Hope Church is a good example. Sherman finds Hooker stopped in front of New Hope Church. Hooker says there's a Confederate corps in front of me. Sherman says there's not 50 rebels in front of you, and orders Hooker to attack on the afternoon of May 25th. Well, that turns into an afternoon and evening fight, ends in a thunderstorm, and the Federals lose about 1,300 people. The Confederates suffer about 300 casualties. very lopsided defeat, and it's largely due to Sherman, um, because Sherman believes that if we push hard and fast, we'll get ahead of them. He doesn't realize that Johnson has already beat him to, he's now laying his whole army is now athwart Sherman's line of advance towards Dallas. Um, and the fight at Pickett's Mill on May 27 is more of the same. They're looking for a flank. We'll start creeping back eastward towards the railroad, and we'll look to turn the Confederate flank, maybe push Johnson away from his railroad. And they almost succeed. Pickett's Mill is they do find a Confederate flank, but Patrick Cleburne's division is there, and Johnson sends enough reinforcements that the Federals don't quite turn the flank. They get within inches of doing so, but it turns into another bloody defeat, another 1,400 Federal casualties, about 450 Confederate infantry casualties, but also Wheeler is pretty beaten up there. He suffers about 300 casualties. So Pickett's Mill is about 1,400 Federal to about 750 or 800 Confederate losses. I think, well, but the most interesting fight is probably Dallas, and it's not what I find most interesting about it is not the Confederate attack, really a reconnaissance in force that happens at Dallas, but rather the fact that in the days leading up to what we call the Battle of Dallas on May 26th and May 27th, Sherman sends repeated orders to McPherson to attack. And this is, I think, one of the lost opportunities. Sherman wants McPherson to basically turn the Confederate left flank and push them towards the Army of the Cumberland. And they're about 5 or 6 miles apart. McPherson has at this time about 30,000 men, his own army of the Tennessee, plus a division, plus an infantry division from Thomas and a cavalry division. And the Confederates only have one small infantry division under William Bate, about 3,500 men opposing him, supported by a Confederate cavalry division. And Sherman sends repeated orders to McPherson to attack. McPherson says, I'll attack, I'll do it, I'll attack at dawn on May 26th, I'll attack at dawn on May 27th, and then he doesn't attack at all. Sherman even sends, there's an interesting character in the campaign, a guy named John M. Corse, who's from Illinois. He's a brigadier general. He was wounded at Missionary Ridge. He returns to command in the spring of 64, and instead of giving him a brigade, Sherman says, I have a job for you. You're going to be on my staff. And Corse says, well, I'd rather command troops and lead troops. And Sherman tells him, don't worry, I'll give you plenty of opportunities to get shot at. He becomes Sherman's troubleshooter.
Okay.
If there's a problem with a commander not doing what Sherman wants him to do, Kenner Garrard, a cavalry commander, for instance, John M. Corse is going to show up at your headquarters as a sort of a personal emissary from Sherman, and give you a kick in the pants. And Corse shows up on May 27th at McPherson's headquarters for exactly that reason, and yet there's still no attack. And Sherman doesn't say anything about this in his memoirs or his reports. He just kind of lets it go. He takes McPherson to task a little bit for Resaca and Snake Creek Gap after the war in his memoirs, but he doesn't say anything about Dallas.
Okay.
Probably helps. McPherson has become something of a hands-off guy because, foreshadowing here, he's going to get killed on July 20.
Right. Oh, you just gave away book 3.
Yeah, I know. Spoiler alert, right?
Well, yeah, because as soon as you started talking about the missed opportunity of Dallas, I, kind of jumped back to thinking about Snake Creek Gap and the missed opportunity there. How do you rate McPherson overall? I mean, is he learning from this campaign? Is he, you know,
Um, of he's I want to get this right here. Uh, I think he's over his head as an army commander.
okay,
Um, he's cautious by nature, and uh, Sherman Sherman doesn't necessarily mind that. Sherman is an interesting mix because he talks, in his writing, in his letters, he's so bellicose and so aggressive, and we must drive them and hit them and hammer them, and yet, um, when it comes down to actual operations, he's very cautious.
yeah,
He makes short moves. He, by and large, does not detach segments of his army and expose them to too much. He's very careful in his movements around Johnson and even around Hood, though he's a little looser around Hood.
uh-huh.
Um, and McPherson reflects that. And McPherson is younger. He begins the war as a staff officer. He's I probably my favorite McPherson quote is McPherson in a letter when he finds out he's been promoted to major general. Uh, um, he tells his mother, "I have no idea why." Okay. um, but I think that army should have gone to John Logan,
Yeah.
who proved himself at Resaca, especially to be much more effective and much more aggressive, and yet careful, not incautious, not liable to make mistakes.
Yeah.
Um, and yet it goes to McPherson. Sherman is comfortable with that. Logan, by and large, is okay with that, though Logan knows that he could command this army, and he would like to.
Yeah.
That's another thing for book 3 or 4.
Yeah. Yeah.
Uh, uh, so, but I think McPherson is the wrong guy, especially since Sherman uses him for most of his flank movements.
Okay.
Thomas has the big army, the Army of the Cumberland, with 50 to 60,000 guys. John Schofield has the small army, the 23rd Corps, with only about 10,000 people. But McPherson has anywhere between 20 and 30,000 troops. Once he gets the 17th Corps, he has almost 30,000 troops under his command. So he has a sizable wing, and 30,000 guys can stand off a Confederate army for at least a day,
Mm-hmm.
until Sherman can get up there. And so if he's your flanking force, then he needs to be more aggressive. Um, he's the guy who's supposed to go out and make things happen,
Right. Right.
and that's not McPherson.
And again, being an engineer, very calculating, so I sort of get his temperament, but I like how you characterize him as in over his head. I think that's probably how I'd probably describe him too. And how's Joe Johnson handling his corps commanders at this point?
Um, Things are changing
Mhm.
between uh, you know you know uh, when Johnson arrives back in January or December, into January of 1864. Um, his two corps commanders are Thomas C. Heineman and William Hardee. He doesn't much like Hardee, and he doesn't think much at all of Heineman. So he secures Hood's promotion, among others. Everybody wants Hood promoted, so it's not like Joe Johnson alone. But Johnson secures Hood's promotion and brings Hood in, gives him Heineman's corps. Johnson or Hood is now the newest lieutenant general, but uh, Johnson really takes a shine to Hood. He likes Hood. Hood's aggressive, and all through the first part of the campaign, all through May and into June, when Johnson does try and orchestrate a counterattack, whether it's at Cassville, or the day after Pickett's Mill, or June 22nd at Kolb's Farm. It's Hood and his corps that he turns to. He's going to be the counterpuncher. Um, Yet by June, his Johnson's opinion of Hood is going down because none of these blows really land or come off well. Um, his opinion of Hardee is going up. They feel like Hardee has been uh, uh, more in agreement with Johnson. At Cassville, for instance, when Hood and Leonidas Polk talk about being unable to hold their position, Hardee says, "Well, I can hold my position. I can hold yours if you want to swap positions. Even. I know I can defend this ground." And Johnson takes that to heart, even though they don't hold at Cassville, they don't stay at Cassville, and they retreat. Johnson, in his memoir, says, "Well, I really wish I'd stood there. I really wish we'd given battle." Um, so things are rising. But on June 14th, Leonidas Polk, who has a really bad reputation in the American Civil War for many, many good reasons. Uh, if you want a disruptive figure in your army, just send for Polk.
Yeah.
He's a terrible subordinate. And yet in the Atlanta campaign, he does fairly well. First of all, he makes perhaps the most important decision of the campaign
Oh.
when he's told to reinforce Johnston with what portion of his force he can spare, quote unquote. He takes all his infantry and a cavalry division. He takes almost 16,000 men, and that's the force that's going to give Johnson even the odds. So that by June, we have that ratio of 75 to 85,000. And when Bragg and Davis back in Richmond, Bragg's now Davis's advisor, when they find out about it, uh, at the end of May, they're literally arguing with Polk. Why did you do this? Why did you take all these troops and strip Mississippi? And Polk says, "Well, you told me to take what force I could spare. So I took what I thought I could spare, which is all this infantry.
Yeah.
And if you don't like it, fire me," basically.
Yeah.
I think without that reinforcement, the North Georgia campaign, the Atlanta campaign would have been much different and over much sooner. And then in the fights at Resaca and in the campaign up to June 14th, Polk does okay. He's not a spectacular corps commander, which is what he is at that point.
Mm-hmm.
But then on June 14th, he gets killed.
Right. So I was going to ask you, he has a dramatic death. I want people to read the book to see how you handle it, but kind of a colorful story, obviously, somewhat of a fraught story in the way that is remembered and recounted. How did you approach that? Because it is a key moment in the Atlanta campaign that people know about.
Well, obviously I wanted to tell the command story. You lose a corps commander, then there's the decisions that have to be made, who gets the corps, who takes over. But also there's some really gruesome aspects to this.
Yeah.
Not just the fact that a cannonball rips his heart out, which is gruesome enough, but the next day Union soldiers are up there dipping their handkerchiefs in the blood and taking them as souvenirs, which I thought was fairly gruesome.
That's grisly.
Well, it's a reminder every once in a while. It's good to have a reminder of how callous war makes people,
Right.
how brutal this conflict really can be in any conflict, whether it's World War II or World War I or uh, the American Revolution. There are gruesome and macabre elements where if you took a civilian unexposed to the horrors of war up there with you, and he saw this, and some newspaper guys saw it, and they're like, "Oh," but to the soldiers, it was just, yeah, hey, a souvenir. War hardens and coarsens people, and that's a stark reminder. So I definitely wanted to fit that in there because it's a shocking juxtaposition. And of course, when Polk is gone, everyone's going to praise him to the high heavens about, what a great soldier, what a great Southern patriot, and et cetera, et cetera. There are a few Confederates who go, well, it's not entirely a bad thing, because if something had happened to Johnson, Polk was the senior commander, and he would have taken over. And I have 3 or 4 different Confederates, staff officers or senior officers, who sort of privately admit that it's probably better that Polk isn't in line to succeed to command of the army if something happened to Johnson.
Yeah. Wow. Yeah. Thinking about that, it's I've
Well,
heard people say like one of the best shots of the war was the one that got Polk because of some of the problems that he posed for his commanders and stuff like that.
yeah.
Um, so right after that, Kennesaw Mountain is probably the main aspect of the Atlanta campaign that people are familiar with. If they know, one
Well,
thing, they can say that.
it's our sole national park
Yeah.
out of the campaign.
Yeah.
Um,
Um, so how do you rate the importance of the actions around Kennesaw?
well, it's still an ongoing part of this stalemate that Sherman is so frustrated by, and again, it's largely driven by Sherman's frustration that the assaults on Kennesaw Mountain happen at all.
Mhm.
Sherman is at his most defensive after Kennesaw Mountain, uh, because I think deep down he knows he made a mistake,
Mhm.
but he won't admit that to anyone. He tells Halleck in Washington, I had to do it. He tells his wife, I had to do it. And he comes up with all these reasons why he had to do it. His memoirs are full of rationales. I couldn't go around his flank anymore. Our supply lines were stretched too thin. Um, but he does also make a couple of valid points. By that point, Sherman's line is something like 9 mile. I mean, Johnson's line is stretched to something like 9 miles.
Yeah.
Um, and Sherman reasons he's got to be thin somewhere. If we can find a thin spot and punch through, then we can break his army up, uh, then we'll go straight through to Marietta, and he'll be in a terrible tactical situation. So, uh, so buried within all those rationalizations is a certain amount of military logic. It makes sense,
Mhm.
and what I try and focus on in describing the assaults on Kennesaw is I looked at the other literature, and I for a couple of reasons, I didn't want to necessarily use all the same quotes. So you felt like you were reading Earl Hess's book or Dan Vermilye's book. Uh,
Right.
um, but also, I noticed very quickly that um, no one really had examined the tactical formations. And it struck me when I was reading the reports, and uh, typically, uh, the argument boils down to, well, Sherman decided he was going to break through at Kennesaw, and he resorted to outdated column attacks, Napoleonic style assaults, which isn't what is happening at all.
Mm.
Um, Sherman basically tells the subordinate commanders that they can choose their formations. They have an opportunity to examine the Confederate line, and they choose where they're going to attack. So they're trying to find the places they think are the weakest, and they're also conducting what amounts to a tactical experimentation. And There are 8 brigades involved in the assaults, 3 from McPherson, basically under John Logan of the 15th Corps. And those 3 brigades all use essentially the same tactical formation, a modified version of Casey's tactics, which has um, each brigade forms in 2 lines of regiments. So if you have 6 regiments in your brigade, 3 are in front, 3 are behind. Um, It's pretty standard formation by 1864, especially in the Western Theater. But the 5 brigades that are drawn from the Army of the Cumberland, each one of those 5 brigades uses a different tactical formation. Some of them form in very narrow columns. They're called column of division, which is basically each regiment forms 2 companies wide by 5 companies deep. Some of them form in column of regiments where the regiment is in battle line, but each regiment is stacked one behind the other. Some have flanking regiments. They're what I came away from, and they're very careful to spell out what formations they have in their reports. We were formed column of division, left in front. Okay, what does that mean? And so I go into a fair amount of detail in the book explaining what left in front and right in front and all of those mean. And then I try and, in the ensuing chapters, discussing each of these brigade attacks, try and show how the brigade commanders and divisional commanders are really seeking ways to break through the Confederate line. What's the best formation to punch through the line? Probably the biggest problem with the assaults at Kennesaw is the fact that many of the troops were moved the night before, so they didn't get a chance to thoroughly reconnoiter the ground they were going to have to cross. And Sherman did that to try and preserve surprise. We don't want the Confederates, we don't want to telegraph where we're attacking, but it also had the disadvantage of that lack of reconnaissance, and they also didn't pick weak points in the Confederate line. So Kennesaw fails, and Sherman spends a lot of time justifying it, as I explained. But it's also interesting to note that what does he return to on June 28th? He goes back to flanking on the
Right.
Confederate on the Union right, the Confederate left, exactly what he said he couldn't do. So
Yeah. Yeah. What changes the situation for him that he finally can when he said he couldn't?
There's no one specific thing.
Yeah.
The Union 23rd Corps, who was also supposed to assault, but John Schofield says, I don't think I can break through here. And Sherman says, okay, no problem. You conduct a diversion. And so Schofield's version of a diversion is to slip south of a stream called Nose's Creek, and try and get close to the railroad south of Marietta. And he does. And that works. And so Sherman is like, okay. That afternoon, he tells Thomas, what do you think about going across Nose's Creek and going to cut the rail line south of Marietta? And Thomas says, great, as long as we don't have to assault more of these earthworks.
Yeah.
So I think the obvious failure of the assaults, plus Schofield's success, it's kind of like a wake-up call maybe to Sherman. He says, well, deep down, he has to know his frustration has gotten the better of him. And you know how somebody will over justify their actions, rationalization after rationalization. It becomes fairly obvious that even they don't really believe what their defense is.
Right.
I get that feeling with Sherman after Kennesaw.
Yeah. When you talk about his frustrations, is this purely on a military level? Because certainly when I'm thinking about the spring of '64 and the Overland Campaign, Grant's thinking about Lincoln and the election hanging right over his shoulders. But Sherman's notoriously non-political or anti-political. Is this a concern for him at all, or is he really just kind of got the eyes on what's right in front of him?
His major concern is not so much political, but it is strategic. It is beyond his own theater of operations. One of the things that Grant emphasizes in their initial planning is don't let Johnson reinforce Robert E. Lee. Don't let him detach troops to send to Virginia. And it's not until after Kennesaw that Halleck, basically in late June, where after Petersburg has failed and basically after Grant is in bogged down in siege warfare, and Lee is actually detaching troops, right, to
Right.
send to the valley and things like that. Um, that Grant through Halleck tells Sherman that you don't need to worry about Johnson reinforcing Lee anymore. Lee has about all the troops he can feed. Uh, he's actually sending guys away, and he warns Sherman that he might be sending troops your way. Jubal Early and the Second Corps might not be, staying in the valley. They might come down your way.
Yeah.
So, uh, Sherman's very concerned about making sure that Johnson isn't able to send troops away, and then secondly, uh, about whether or not the Confederates are going to reinforce Johnson. He's not so much worried, or he's less worried, I should say, about that reinforcement because he thinks he can handle more Confederates. He has a pretty solid army, but he's really worried about letting down Grant.
Yeah.
And so that's a thrust of a lot of this attack pressure. We've got to keep pressure on the Confederates.
I have about 30,000 more questions I want to ask you. We're running out of time here today. I'll have to
Right.
get you back on to talk about this some more. Before we do wrap up today, any final thoughts you want as folks are kind of thinking about, should I pick up the book? Shouldn't I? Anything you want them to kind of have in mind as they approach the book?
Um, uh, that's always a tough question for me. First of all, I personally buy a lot of books.
As
If there's
evidenced by your background.
yeah, if there's a new Civil War book out, chances are I'm going to buy it. That said, and also I'm very deeply immersed in the Atlanta campaign right now. I'm fascinated by it. I think if you want to get an appreciation for the campaign as a whole, or the campaign as it evolves, and not just touch on the high points, then you'll really like volumes 1 and 2. And you'll definitely get a sense of how the campaign changes between May and June. So hopefully that's a selling point. We'll see.
Yeah. Well, your Chickamauga work was just redefining, and so far, what I've seen of the Atlanta series, it promises to have that same sort of impact on the literature. So I've been very excited to follow along on the
Well,
campaign with you.
thank you. Those are kind words, and all I do is sit down and write and see how it goes.
Yeah. And I'll point out, like, every most Wednesdays, you've been giving us little treats at Emerging Civil War on the blog.
Yeah.
You're like, oh, here's something cool that I kind of came across this week. So it's been fun to follow your progress that way too. So if folks are looking for a little bit to keep their appetite whetted between volumes, check out Dave's work on our Wednesdays. So Dave, thanks for being with me today.
Well, thank you for having me. This is fun as always.
Thanks, pal. I'm Chris Mikowski on behalf of Dave Powell for Emerging Civil War. We'll see you online and on the battlefield.